I was 22 years old, attending a Halloween gathering at my former best friend Nick's house, who passed away from a drug overdose in 2013. Before his death, he would host big Halloween parties every year at his house, as his parents regularly flew to New York to attend their friend's party. He was a massive Halloween fan, so the whole house was packed with intensely spooky decorations that everyone knew Nick had spent way too much money on. He even put up giant cardboard walls, covering them with wallpaper, to create a haunted maze experience. I'll keep this story PG-13, so I'll skip the part about certain festivities and get right to where things turned bad. I'll admit we weren't in the best frame of mind. None of us were. Anyone who came to Nick's parties knew the scene. Me, Nick, and a few others, Vinny G, Joey, and Q, were upstairs in Nick's room, hanging out when we heard two loud, steady bangs come from downstairs. Nick stumbled, but frantically rushed to open the door and see what was going on. There were screams from both guys and girls. I remember vividly how it sounded like a whole crowd of people screaming for their lives down there. We all called for Nick to get back in and close the door. Even under the influence, we knew something was very wrong. Nick hurried back in, shutting the door carefully but quietly, locking it behind him. He turned to us with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a horror. "What did you see? What's happening?" We all shouted at him. He told us to hide before saying anything else. We all knew why. From that moment, we stopped asking questions. Nick dimmed the lights and hid in the closet with Joey, while I hid under the bed with Q, and Vinny G hid in the storage box. We could hear the blaring music from downstairs go silent, followed by a man yelling at everyone to be quiet. One terrified girl let out a scream, and after another bang, silence fell. The man started yelling again, but I couldn't make out the words and definitely don't remember what he was shouting. We heard two other men yelling. By then, we knew there were at least 3 intruders, though there could have been more, for all we knew. We heard the sound of boots stomping up the stairs, coming halfway down the hall and stopping right outside the bedroom door. The intruder on the other side tried the doorknob, but realizing it was locked, he started slamming into it with what was probably his shoulder. After a few failed attempts, the sound of gunshots shattered the lock, and the door swung open. We heard cries from downstairs after the gunshots, followed by silence and more shots. Nick and I held our hands over our mouths to muffle our breathing. Through the thin cloth that hung from the bottom of Nick's bed, I watched the black boots with tattered, overlapping jeans move straight toward the closet. He opened the door. I heard Nick pleading, offering money if they'd just leave. Nick identified himself as the homeowner, and the intruder ordered him downstairs. The rest of us stayed put. Apparently, Joey hadn't been found with Nick. Under the bed, we were shaking and terrified. There was near silence from downstairs, other than Nick talking with the intruders, but whatever they were saying was far too low to hear. It felt like a solid 20 minutes before the front door finally slammed, and Nick ran back upstairs to tell us they were gone. I think the most terrifying moment of my life was when I stepped downstairs, back into the living room, and saw the 2 bodies lying lifelessly on the floor, blood seeping from the wounds on their heads. Jen and Robbie, 2 dear friends I still miss. I'll spare you the details of what happened when the police arrived, but despite the house smelling like a greenhouse, the police were more focused on finding out who the masked men were that took the lives of 2 innocent students. Nicky had told the 4 of us hiding in his room that there were 4 intruders altogether, each one dressed in a fedora, a vendetta mask, coats, and gloves. They demanded $100,000 in cash, and when Nick couldn't provide it, they insisted he fill their empty sack with his most prized possessions. All the partygoers held hostage in the room were forced to toss their wallets into the sack under the threat of being shot. After the ordeal, Nick spiraled into depression. He began drinking heavily, turning to alcohol as a coping mechanism. He stopped attending school, eventually dropping out entirely. He then began using heavier drugs, like meth and heroin. I had one meaningful talk with him after the incident, and he was more open in that conversation than ever before. He tearfully confessed to me, with a pipe in hand, that he was in constant pain, feeling responsible for the death of 2 of his closest friends. Nick passed away from a heroin overdose in July 2013, not even a year after that night. It was my first Halloween living on my own, away from my parents. I had a small corner house with a basement, but no upper floor, a house my parents helped me buy. It was 11 p.m., and I was sitting in the living room watching Halloween horror movies when I found myself rising to answer a knock at the door. But then I stopped and thought, who would be knocking at this hour? It was way past trick-or-treating time. I assumed it was some late-night Halloween prankster, so I waited, then shot a glance toward the porch through the window. No one was there. Yup, just some prankster. I sat back down, not giving it much thought, until the knocking resumed. "Get lost," I shouted, annoyed and not in the mood for mischievous kids. They ignored me, escalating to pounding now. I was fed up. I jumped up and swung the door open, but again, no one was there. I slipped on my shoes, stepped outside, and searched around the bushes, but there was no one in sight. Not in the bushes, not behind my car, not across the street. I was done responding. I didn't want to entertain their game any further, so I went back inside, double-locked the door, and went to my bedroom, locking that door as well, just to feel a bit more secure. Even with the TV on, I could still hear the obnoxious pounding on my front door. I was this close to calling the cops, but that would probably lead to my house being egged or TP'd. The pounding persisted for an uncomfortably long stretch, over half an hour. I figured these pranksters must be recording something for YouTube, desperate for a reaction, but I wasn't going to give it to them. At some point, I fell asleep with the TV on, only to wake up to the knocking again. I checked the clock, 2 in the morning. How could they still be at this? I turned off the TV and sat up, listening intently. My heart sank as I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the front door, but from my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed, frantically searching my room for something I could use as a weapon. They knew I was awake. They were testing the doorknob, trying to break down the door. These weren't any kids. Desperately, I came up with a plan. It was a long shot, but it was the only idea I had. I turned on the receiver to my speaker system, plugged in my phone, pulled up YouTube, typed in 45 gunshot sound effect, cranked up the volume, and hit play. The sound of a gunshot rang out from the speakers, loud and convincing. I paused the video after the first shot and shouted, "That was a warning shot. Leave now, or I won't hesitate to put a bullet in your head." It worked. I heard 2 pairs of footsteps pounding across my wooden floors and out the front door. I waited a few moments before opening my bedroom door and cautiously peeking outside. They were gone, but the front door was left wide open. I quickly shut the door, called the police, and that's where my story ended. I'd never really been a huge Halloween fan anyway, mostly because I grew up without many friends. By the time I turned 10, I could no longer use the excuse of going out with my mom, and it wasn't as if I had friends to go with. So, last Halloween, when I was 14, it didn't seem like I'd be trick-or-treating. My younger sister, who's only 8, went out with my mom. My one good friend, Steve, already had plans, and I didn't want to impose. A small part of me felt a spark of happiness when my mom asked me to stay home and hand out candy. Now, I actually had something to do. Something that didn't involve trick-or-treating alone like a loser. My mom left with my sister around 6 p.m., about an hour after she got home from work, and said they'd be back around 9. I was sprawled on the couch in the living room, enjoying the AMC Scary Movie Marathon and getting up every so often to hand out candy to kids. While I was doing that, the kitchen phone started ringing. The ringer was set so loud it made me jump. I picked up the phone, and on the other end there was silence except for a bit of fumbling and some faint background noises, like someone just holding the receiver. I said hello about 5 times before they finally hung up. I figured it was just someone playing a Halloween prank on me. What else could I do but ignore it? This worked fine for a few minutes as I went back to watching TV and answering the door. But then the phone rang again. Same unknown number on the caller ID. I decided to see where this was going, so I answered it once more. This time I could hear faint breathing on the other end. "All right, Steve, I know it's you," I said into the phone. They hung up. At this point, I wouldn't say I was scared, but I was definitely feeling a little uneasy. It was a while before the phone rang again. It was getting later, darker, and the doorbell was ringing less and less. I was watching the original Friday the 13th when it happened again. The phone's ringing had taken on a sickening feeling, as I knew who, or rather, who I didn't know, would be on the other end. For some reason, I caved again and picked up. And once again, silence, except for the faint breathing and fumbling on the other side. This went on for nearly half a minute until they finally spoke in a distorted, deep voice. "I'll be paying you a visit tonight." I'd had enough of this prank. I told them to get lost, slammed the phone down, and promised myself I wouldn't pick it up again. About half an hour later, without warning, the power went out. The lights shut off, the TV died. Complete darkness. I stood there, frozen in fear. One loud, angry pounding came from the front door. I lost it, screaming like a little kid. But then, I heard something from outside. Laughter. I recognized that laughter. I opened the door, and there he was, Stephen. I shoved him down the steps, furious. "So it was you making those dumb phone calls?" I asked. He nodded, still laughing. "That didn't sound like you on the phone. Do that voice again," I said. "What?" He looked confused. "I didn't say anything, you moron. I just called and did the heavy breathing. I thought he was messing with me at first." Then my heart sank. I led him to the fuse box outside. Just as I feared, it had been opened, and all the wires were cut. I think we ran back inside faster than any Olympic sprinter. I called my mom, who told us to stay put and wait for the police, who she then called. They traced the call to a payphone outside a nearby bar. I still wonder, was it just a prank that went too far? Or a possible break-in, or who knows what else? Waiting to happen. I don't think I ever want to find out. When I was younger, my friends and I went trick-or-treating every year. One particular year, as we were trick-or-treating, we passed a man standing eerily still with a mask on, holding a lantern. As we walked past him, he turned his entire body around to follow us with his eyes. We felt uneasy, but with plenty of people around, we pressed on to the next house. My friends and I spotted him repeatedly. As we went from house to house, he seemed to be trailing us like something out of a horror movie. We walked slowly and realized how he was keeping pace with us. At one house, when he hadn't been in sight for a bit, we collected our candy. But as we turned to head back to the street, there he was, standing in the road, watching us. Right away, we knocked again on the door and told the homeowners about him. The masked figure kept on walking down the road, and we didn't see him for the rest of the night. Later on, a family friend mentioned he had seen a masked man hiding behind a tree, waving kids over, only stopping when he threatened to call the police. I was trick-or-treating with my friend Casey. We were both 11 at the time. We were walking across a small wooden bridge over a narrow river called Jack Winkle River when a black Jeep pulled up on the far side, essentially blocking our path. We turned around and quickly walked away. We were the type of kids who knew the stranger danger rules. We could hear the Jeep's windows rolling down, and a man with a rough smoker's voice called out, urging us to come back, asking for directions. I yelled back, "Sorry," and we hurried on. The Jeep was too big for the narrow bridge, so it backed off and drove around to the other side. We thought we'd lost the creepy driver until an SUV suddenly swerved around the corner and braked hard in front of us. Once again, the driver rolled down the window. Now, with them right beside us, we saw there were two other passengers. An older man with gray curly hair and a mustache in the back seat. Also with a raspy voice, told us to get in, promising free candy. The Jeep did a 3-point turn and kept tailing us wherever we went. Eventually, the Jeep accelerated past us, stopped up ahead, and both front and back passenger doors opened as the two creepy men jumped out, lunging toward us. We dropped our bags of candy and ran straight to my house, which we could see now. We rang the doorbell frantically at least 20 times. The men couldn't keep up, and seeing us reach the house, they turned back. My mom opened the door, and we screamed and pointed at the Jeep, which was now reversing away. She rushed us inside, locked the door, and called the police, as any mom would. She reported the black Jeep with 3 older men, all with raspy voices, and every other detail we remembered. My mom was worried all night, especially since they now knew where we lived. My dad tried to calm her, but she couldn't relax. Finally, the police sent an unmarked car to sit out front for a few hours. That helped a bit, but what really eased our minds was when my dad woke us to see the flashing red and blue lights outside the unmarked car. They had stopped an SUV and a black Jeep, with 3 men in cuffs, the same creepy men who tried to kidnap me and Casey. My dad went out to speak with the officer, most likely confirming they were the same men. Casey and I stood in the doorway and yelled to get their attention. They looked over, and we both flipped them off. My mom then pulled us inside, shut the door, and sent us to bed. That night went from the worst in our lives to the best. This happened on Halloween. I had taken my 7-year-old daughter, Jamie, trick-or-treating, and afterward, I made dinner, we watched some TV together, and then I tucked her in. I was especially tired, so I got ready for bed myself. Shortly after, Jamie came in and said there was someone in her closet. I reassured her no one was there. She asked to sleep with me, but once again, I assured her she was safe in her room. She hesitantly returned to her room, closing the door behind her. I thought to myself that if she came back, I'd take her over to the closet and show her there was nothing to be scared of. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, she returned. I asked her why she believed someone was hiding in her closet. She replied that she had heard noises, things shifting and falling over. I'll admit, hearing that sent a chill through me for a second. I walked her to her room, switched on the lights, and with a smirk asked, "Anyone hiding in here?" We listened closely. I didn't expect anything until we heard it, a thump from inside the closet. I yelled for Jamie to run to the neighbors and call the police. As she ran, I swung open the closet door and, to my shock, found our neighbor's son, Randy, perched on my daughter's Lego box. I grabbed him by his shirt collar and yanked him up, furious. I walked him angrily to his parents' house next door, where Jamie was already ringing the bell. When they opened the door, I pushed him inside, explaining everything to his father. I told them I wouldn't press charges, but if I ever saw him near Jamie again, they'd all regret it. Randy's dad, Mark, slapped him across the face, then invited us in so Randy could explain. Jamie and I stepped inside. It turned out that while I'd taken Jamie out trick-or-treating, he'd snuck into our house through an open window, hiding in her closet with his friend, Daryl. I asked if Daryl was still in the house. He said yes. I told Jamie to wait with Mark while I ran back inside. And there he was. This Daryl kid, even creepier looking than Randy, standing with Jamie's underwear in his hand. I acted purely out of protective fury, grabbing the little punk by the throat and throwing him down, hitting him across the face 4 times, then reluctantly letting him leave. I chose not to involve the police, only because of my close friendship with Mark. But I made it crystal clear that if they even waved at Jamie again, they'd end up in the news. We went to bed, letting Jamie sleep with me after that ordeal. She was shaken up. The next morning, I found a small drill hole in her closet door. Those twisted punks had been spying on her while she slept, messing around with her belongings. Unless you're a parent, you might not fully grasp the horror of this story, but there are days I regret not calling the police. I still could, but since nothing else has happened, I figure it's best not to stir things up now. Jamie's 13 now, and Randy's gone off to college. We just moved into a large new house in Mississauga, Ontario, in an area called Winston Churchill. It was Halloween, and my parents, 4 sisters, my brother, and I were settling into our new rooms, unpacking and chatting about leaving our old schools and friends behind. My mom called us for chores. I was already exhausted. It was 11:30 p.m., well after the Halloween excitement, and now we had chores? It took forever. But when I finished, I went to my room to finally sleep. I heard footsteps in the upstairs hall, assuming it was my brother or sister. I got up, ready to tell them to stop messing with me, but no one was there. Confused, I hurried down to the basement where my parents, brother, and sister were busy working. I asked if any of them had been upstairs. They said no. Now I was pretty freaked out, but told myself it was just my imagination. Shrugging it off, I returned to bed, which now felt icy cold. I put on a sweater, but it was still too cold. Around 12:30 a.m., I woke up suddenly to a loud banging sound echoing from my parents' bedroom. I thought it could just be one of my siblings up for a drink of water, but too nervous to go alone. But I was mistaken. The banging continued, each time louder than before. I tried to brush it off and fall asleep, but curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to check it out. Stepping into the hallway, there was no one to be seen. As I got closer, the banging stopped. I stared at the door for a moment, then decided to head back to bed. Only minutes later, the banging resumed, louder than before. I felt chills run through me. I tried falling asleep again, but as usual for me, it wasn't happening. Then, my bedroom door creaked open, as if nudged slightly. It was too dark to see who or what was there. "Hey, who's messing around? What's going on? Let me get some sleep," I called out. Suddenly, I heard light footsteps approaching my bed. Thinking it was one of my sisters, I rolled onto my side once they stopped, only to see a tall, shadowy figure looming beside me, standing well over 7 feet. My throat tightened, but I couldn't scream. I lay there, frozen with fear, until the figure finally whispered, "Boo." That was all it took. I screamed as loud as I could, covering my eyes as my parents rushed in, switching on the light. But there was no one there, no figure by my bed. I poured out everything to my parents, the knocking, the shadowy figure. My siblings crowded the doorway, staring at me like I was losing it. I asked if anyone had heard the banging on their door, but my parents just looked at me, bewildered. Apparently, they'd heard nothing at all. They all glanced at me like I was crazy, but I'm certain I didn't imagine it. This was years ago, also on Halloween night. We were all about 20, just the right age for haunted attractions. It's one of the best ways to celebrate Halloween. That year, we visited a place called Scarehouse Journey to the Basement or something like that. It only ran for 4 years in our town before it disappeared. This was its final year, and it was one of the best haunted houses I'd ever been to. Rather than a guided tour, this place was set up as a maze where you had to make it to the basement, find a key, and use it to unlock the way out. A very original haunted house. Unfortunately, our night didn't go as planned, as you'll soon understand. We started off in the living room, a spooky setting with a massive, open coffin smack in the center of the room. Cobwebs hung from every corner, dust covering old, cracked furniture, and, of course, bloodstains on the creaky floorboards. We could tell right away it was going to be a memorable experience. The next area was the dining room, where things took an even creepier turn. Every room beyond that point was dimly lit by artificial lanterns on the walls, casting eerie shadows. As we moved through, actors in disturbing costumes jumped out at us in unexpected moments, startling us each time. We got turned around a lot, going in circles trying to find the basement door. It was no ordinary house, designed more like a maze with false doors and dead ends. When we finally found the way down to the basement, I'll admit I felt nervous. The pitch-black stairwell made it feel like we'd wandered into an area we weren't supposed to be in, maybe where they stored props. Since cell phones weren't allowed, we couldn't use them to light our way. We had no choice but to descend in the darkness if we wanted to escape. Each step echoed painfully, as loud as nails on a chalkboard. We all laughed nervously, trying to shake off how scared we were feeling. I reached out with my hands, feeling my way through the dark when I bumped into someone. I quickly apologized, asking, "Who's that?" But there was no answer. The person I'd run into simply rested a hand on my shoulder. That's when I bolted, screaming but laughing at the same time. Because there was something deeply unsettling about being in that enormous, pitch-black basement, knowing someone else was in there with us. One of my pals luckily discovered a key on a table in the corner of the room. We all dashed back upstairs, toward the light, and located the exit door. The actual ordeal and journey of navigating that labyrinth of a haunted house took much longer than my account suggests, but that's not where things turned terrifying. Just outside the exit door was a small bin with a notice that read, "Please drop keys here." That was how the staff would gather the keys and return them to the basement. Halfway off the grounds of the haunted house, the exit door swung open, and a really tall figure clad in a black robe and a bloodied pig mask stepped out and began trailing in our direction. He or she, though it was probably a he, so I'll refer to him as he, seemed to be one of the employees for the attraction. As we walked further away from the attraction, so did the man in the costume. It appeared to us that he was tailing us by this point. One of my friends shouted, "We don't have the key if that's what you want." We dropped it in the little bin. But that didn't do the trick. As a gag, we began running just to see if he would too, and he did. We halted, and so did he. We remained still, and so did he. At first, it was amusing. Maybe it was just a prank, but as we neared my friend Eddie's house, we started to debate whether we should disclose where he lived to this guy. He had been shadowing us for at least 5 blocks by now, so if it was a joke, it had gone far enough. Eddie's parents were both at home, so we felt secure going inside. Apparently, Eddie's front door was broken, whatever that meant, so we had to run back. We jokingly waved at the jerk still trailing us and headed to Eddie's backyard, closing the gate behind us. Wiping our feet on his welcome mat at the back door, we heard the gate creak open. The man appeared from behind the side of the house and began advancing toward us once again. This time, much quicker. Eddie opened the back door and called to his dad, asking him to get his gun. This seemed to catch the masked man's attention. He slowed his pace and turned his head to face Eddie. Eddie's dad came out, furious as hell, and aimed his pistol at the masked intruder. He raised his hands and pleaded not to shoot, claiming he was only 27. Eddie's dad told him to get lost and never return. And the next time, he wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. Personally, I wish Eddie's dad had made the guy kneel and remove the mask, then call the authorities. That guy got off too easily. For all we know, he could have been armed as well. We reached out to the haunted house attraction, and they informed us that they had no such staff member dressed in a pig mask.